Hello students. In the last video we discussed about what are the factors which affect the working capital. Now in this video we will discuss about the factors which affect the working capital. Okay. So before that you must know what is working capital. So working capital is the amount which is available with the company which it can readily use for day-to-day operations. So working capital is nothing but the capital which is available for day-to-day operations. Okay. So now we will see which are the factors or what are the factors which affect the working capital. Okay. So the first factor is length of operating cycle. Okay. So what is the length of operating cycle? It is a long cycle or it is a short cycle. Now what is operating cycle? Okay. So operating cycle is the time period of the time required for completing the production, right from acquiring the resources till selling the resources and getting the payment. Okay, so that time period is called operating cycle. Okay, so if the operating cycle is long, then more capital will be required, more working capital will be required, whereas if the company is having short operating cycle, then the working capital requirement will be less. Next we have nature of the business. Now the amount of working capital requirement is also affected by the nature of business. Okay, usually the trading organizations and service industries require less working capital as compared to manufacturing industry. Okay, but at the same time the wholesalers are required more working capital than the retailers. Why? Because the wholesalers are required to maintain large stock of goods, but the retailer does not maintain large stock of goods. Okay, so that is why the wholesaler requires more working capital than a retailer. So what kind of business, what is the nature of your business also decide or also affects the working capital. Next is scale of operations. Now what is the scale of the operation of the business? Okay, organizations which operate at higher scale require more working capital as compared to organizations which operate at lower scale. So what is the scale, whether it is a large scale or small scale, on the basis of that it will affect the working capital. Okay, next is technology and production cycle. In the last video about the factors affecting the fixed capital, we saw that if a company is capital intensive, it would require more fixed capital. Okay, but less fixed capital if it is a labor intensive. Okay, but here it is opposite. Okay, if a company is labor intensive, it would require more working capital. Why? Because it has to maintain enough cash for making payments to the laborers, and it would require less working capital if it is a capital intensive. Okay, so the next point is business cycle fluctuations. Now working capital requirement is also affected by the different phases of the business cycle. Okay, different phases of business cycle. Now higher amount of working capital is required in case of boom, when both the production as well as the sales are higher, and during the phase of depression the requirement for working capital is low due to lower sales and production. Okay, so the business cycle fluctuations also decides the requirement for working capital. Next factor is seasonal factors. So seasonality in the operations of the business firm also affects the requirement for working capital. Okay, now during the peak season, okay, the requirement for working capital is more because of higher level of activity. However, this requirement reduces during the lean season. Okay, when the season is at peak, there would be more requirement of working capital because the demand for goods is higher, and at the same time when the demand for goods is lower, so at that point of time the working capital would be less. We would require less amount of working capital. For example, in winters, if a company is manufacturing woolen cloths or sweaters, in winter it would require more working capital to fulfill the demand, but at the same time during summer the same company would require less working capital because during that point of time the demand for sweaters is less in comparison to winters. So seasonal factor also affects the working capital. Next is credit allowed. Now what type of credit policy the company is following? Okay, whether it is following a liberal credit policy or strict credit policy. If suppose, but before that you must know what is credit policy. Okay, so what is credit policy? The average collection period for the sales proceed. Okay, you are selling some goods on credit, what is the time period you are getting back the money from your from the person to whom you have given credit. Okay, so that is credit policy. So if the company is maintaining or following liberal credit policy, then it will require more working capital, whereas if a company is following strict or short-term credit policy, then it can manage with less working capital also. Okay, such policy depend upon the level of competition and the credit worthiness of the clients. Last but not the least, we have credit avail. Now, what is the time period the company is getting from its supplier to pay the credit? Okay, so how long and how much the company is getting credit from the suppliers? If the suppliers of raw materials are giving long-term credit, then the company can manage with less working capital, whereas if the suppliers are giving only short period credit, then the company will require more working capital to make payments to its creditors. I hope it is clear. So in the next video we will discuss what are the factors which affect the capital structure. Okay, thank you.